Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. We're going to give it a few minutes just to allow more people to join and then we'll start. Okay, I think as it's 1 o'clock and we are going to be prompt today, we'll start. My name is Tracy Bignell. I'm Director of Policy Engagement at Race Equality Foundation. I'm very excited to have been involved with this work with Crisis. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you know, Crisis did some research and the research was published last year on racism and homelessness. And we had the first webinar at the end of last year. Today's one is very much focused on services and looking at solutions within services for homelessness. And then we have a final webinar, which will be coming in next month, which will focus on policy solutions. So in terms of our session today, we have a number of speakers. So we will have presentations from 5 speakers today and end with a Q&A session so that you can be very involved in dissecting some of what you've heard, but also in how we can move forward in terms of making solutions. I want to just remind us in terms of I suppose we can call them house rules for the webinar. So we are actually recording this webinar and it will be made available and we will let you know afterwards how that will happen. Can I ask you all to keep yourself on mute so there's no disruption when people are presenting? Following the presentations, as I said, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers and various discussions. We will ask you also to use the Q&A function to put any questions you have to either of the presenters in the chat. And also to put the name of the speaker if you are asking a specific question to someone rather than a general question to all of those who are taking part today. So I just want to briefly mention who our presenters are. So we have Jill McIntyre, who's a project manager at iSphere at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. And Jill manages a homelessness amongst Black and minoritized ethnic research program. And she's going to talk today about some of that work and wider implications. We also have Georgia Leith, who is the Senior Research and Evaluation Officer at Crisis. And Georgia is part of the team that led to the publication of Where Do I Belong? Where is Home? And that was a research report from people of Black and minoritized ethnic backgrounds on racism and homelessness. Then we move on to hearing from Henry Baptiste, who's the co-director of Pathway Housing Solutions, and they are a not-for-profit housing company based in East Midlands, and the aim is to develop community-led housing as a solution to acute problems of housing disadvantage and homelessness, and providing affordable homes in some of the most disadvantaged communities. We will hear from Harinder Bering, who's a legal services team within Shelter, and she has co-led the Race and Housing Research Project and is part of the leadership team responsible for implementing the recommendations of the research you're going to hear from today. We'll hear from Daisy Lunn, who's the team manager at the Ruby Project, part of Solace Women's Aid. And Daisy has worked with women's homelessness and multiple disadvantage in London, with a background in generic homelessness prior to taking up her role at Solace Women's Aid. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I am going to pass over so we can hear our first presenter of the day, which is Jill McIntyre from iSphere Project.
Hi there, good afternoon all from a really sunny Edinburgh for once, which is really lovely, but apologies the glare on my screen at the moment. So yeah, I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about our research programme, and the reason for doing this today is, I suppose, really just to kind of provide a bit of an overview of what research tells us is working and isn't working in services for Black and minoritised ethnic communities. So on to the next slide, a bit about our research. This is a 3-year research programme, which is looking at propelling a fundamental step change in the UK evidence base on homelessness amongst people from Black and minoritised ethnic groups in the UK. It's with thanks to the Oak Foundation, and it's also overseen by an expert research advisory group, which includes representatives from the major homelessness organisations, including Shelter and Crisis. We also have GRF representation, Runnymede Trust, and wider independent stakeholders on our group as well. As I say, it's a 3-year programme, and we've been looking at the statistical picture alongside some rich qualitative evidence, so deep dives into key groups, issues, and experiences of concern for different communities. We are just coming up towards the end of the programme, and to date there are 4 publications which are on the slides there, and we also have 3 more coming soon. I will today give a bit of an overview of findings that are relevant to services, which cut across all of these reports, including the ones that are coming soon, so you get a kind of ahead of time insight into some of those findings as well. So we had the first State of the Nation report back in November 2022. That's our kind of real statistical research. Then we've looked at different conceptualizations of homelessness in England with Runnymede Trust. And as part of our programme, we have research interns from Black and minoritised communities to look specifically into key issues. So the first of our interns, Ewan at Kyorta, looked at the phenomenon of Roma homelessness. We then had Ronnie, or Christiana Aja Thomas, who looked at young Black experiences of homelessness in London. And our current intern is Nifemi Adesini, who's been looking at research, ethnicity and multiple disadvantage services as well, and how suitable they are for people from Black and minoritised communities. We've also been working with the West Midlands Combined Authority on a major deep dive on designing out homelessness amongst minoritised communities in the West Midlands. And we've been working on lots of further statistical and lived experience analysis that will be featured in our final report coming later this year. So, key findings, if you're not already aware, obviously homelessness is by far experienced much more statistically by Black and minoritised communities. They have the highest risks of homelessness across all types of homelessness types. And if I just go on to the next slide, you can see how stark that looks statistically. And going on to the following slide, despite being at the highest risks of homelessness, we find that Black and minoritised communities face discrimination, suffer from major inequalities in the housing outcomes, and are often underrepresented in services that are supporting homeless people, such as Housing First. And you can see on this slide that we also find that discrimination, people felt that they were discriminated against much more if they had experience of homelessness than if they hadn't had experience of homelessness. So we know that there are major issues that cannot just be put down to indirect reasons, but absolutely direct reasons of why ethnicity is a barrier for people. So based on that, if we go on to the key issues slide, I just wanted to pull out a couple of the themes that we've found in all our research to date, which might be relevant to the service sector. First of all, obviously discrimination and racism. We've found several examples of direct and indirect racism and discrimination. And just to give you a kind of feel for some of those, obviously we've heard really harrowing stories recently about the impact of last year's right-wing riots in terms of fear that they invoked, in terms of people feeling safe and being safe. But we've also found structural inequalities at play and unconscious bias as well. Very common in our findings has been discrimination from private landlords, for example, in our Roma study, and also, for example, in things like the move to online lettings and professionals only, no-fault evictions. All of these things adversely impact on Black and minoritized communities, much more so than white communities. Social housing, statutory and community services, there seems to be less of our discrimination, but also still a belief in many people that we've spoken to that discrimination exists. And we've found some examples in policy, for example, through definitions of homelessness work. One of the key findings was that complexity of social housing allocation system can actually amount to institutional racism, as it's much harder for some groups of people without IT or with language that are not English as their first language. Obviously, that's much more likely to impact negatively on them. Linked to this, the next theme, the trust deficit, probably a theme that many of you will be familiar with. And certainly Ronnie in her report on young Black Londoners found several injustices in the criminal justice system for Black people, and that they felt that that had creeped through into their willingness to go to services, and also into their reactions to the experience that they had through the statutory homeless system. All of the young people that she spoke to had negative experiences of the statutory homelessness system. There's obviously, of course, distinct challenges for new immigrants, asylum seekers. I'm sure that will come up in the discussions today, and I won't separate this out for now. But it should be borne in mind that distrust of the state can, of course, be an additional issue for people from asylum system in terms of wanting to access support from services. But we also have to bear in mind that trust deficit issue can sometimes be used as an excuse, as too can the kind of cultural competencies and cultural assumptions. But we do see that lots of services have been developed with the kind of nuclear family norm to the detriment of communities with more diverse arrangements. We also have found some problematic assumptions about, for example, overcrowding being much more acceptable or less harmful just because it's more common for minoritized groups such as Roma or Asian communities. And obviously as well, throughout our research, we've found some really troubling findings about stereotypes, for example, perception of Black men and women as being more violent or less vulnerable than white counterparts. And it's also one of the reasons that we have found that Black people are much less likely to sleep rough, because that's a safety concern for many people. We've also seen in West Midlands, we've heard discussion that South Asian households, because it may be more commonplace, that there may be domestic abuse, some people feel that that's almost more acceptable, and that the people are not getting as positive a response when they come forward to services. And I know that that's a theme that will come out in Solis's discussion today. So there are, of course, pretty practical barriers. Access to information, community knowledge transmission can be better amongst some communities than others. For example, in accessing statutory homelessness assistance, there can be issues with IT for some groups, and language issues, of course. But is really kind of frustrating that in this day and age we still found so many examples of services, including statutory services, not being able to support language requirements. For example, in the FEMI's research, which we'll be publishing soon, somebody in prison wasn't able to access housing support services because a translator wasn't available. That just doesn't feel acceptable. More limited options for support exist for many communities as well. That might be because of larger or multi-generational living, reducing the housing availability, but also, as I've alluded to, the fear of, or indeed actually racist abuse and issues in some areas affecting people's ability to be housed in specific locations. Or there may be additional locational requirements, for example, having access to places of worship, specialist charities, language classes. Sometimes these aren't always taken into account. And what we've found time and time again is that services are often only accessed at point of crisis by Black and minoritized communities for a variety of reasons. One quote I'll just leave this with you is that from Ronnie's research is it shouldn't take me getting stabbed to get a bit of help. Often Black people found that it was only at crisis points that they were actually able to get support. So on to the final slide. That's all been pretty doom and gloom, but I know that there's so many people on this call that have lots of examples of really good practice. And of course, we found that through this research as well. So examples of that is actually data on different ethnicities being collected and used to make changes, to help services think, why are we not getting to that certain part of our community and actually doing that, or to confront inequalities. We've also seen great examples of joint working, of outreach, of training to improve that cultural competency that I spoke about. We've seen positive impact from diversity across the service sector. Although that's not a solution in itself, it will go a long way to helping understand issues. And I think linked to that as well, the mix of mainstream and specialist services for Black and minoritized communities. And of course, probably the most important thing is when people actually identify, address, and challenge discriminatory policy and practice, and take that person-centric approach to support. So just on to the final slide. This is just the link to our research and my contact details, and please do get in touch if you've got any questions. It's pretty whirlwind stop there, and I think I've still gone over time, apologies, but do let us know if there's any questions that you have. And also Professor Suzanne Fitzpatrick, who leads the programme, will be talking to the March seminar as well about what we found around services, around systems in terms of the homelessness systems. Okay, I'll pass on now to Georgia.
Thanks very much, Jill.
Okay, hello everyone. So I am Georgia and I work at Crisis. I am going to touch on the research that our organisation did with some community researchers last year, but a lot of the detail of that research is in the previous webinar of this webinar series. For those who would like a reminder or weren't there for that first webinar and don't know much about this research, just quickly to describe that it involved interviews with 58 people across England, Scotland and Wales from Black and minoritized ethnic groups who had experienced homelessness. It was gathering together their experiences and perspectives of experiencing racism through the homelessness system and before becoming homeless. And it was essentially to kind of use their own words and their own voices to shine a light on the racist practices that were seen in those trends that Jill just introduced us to in the previous presentation. So I won't go into any detail about the findings themselves particularly, but I am going to just do a quick focus on some of the findings that people told us about as part of those interviews. So these are just some very light, very, very small comments from individual people. So it's all qualitative, it's all people's own stories, but these are the observations and experiences that people talked about, particularly about using services, housing services and homelessness services. Generally, compared to the rest of the content in the report, there weren't overt experiences of racism when dealing with staff in the housing and homelessness system. However, they did talk about feeling that the treatment that they'd received made them concerned that they were being prevented from accessing the most effective support that they could. Pulling out 4 of these are the one person who talked about how they had been reluctant to advocate for themselves in the services because of a concern that they'd be dismissed or that the service would sort of withdraw from them. In using their words, they thought that the service might pull away because they were an angry Black woman, or that it would be interpreted as refusing to cooperate. So by not advocating for themselves, we can kind of imagine what effect that has in terms of not getting the support that they need. And another was about having requests for extra documentation around their citizenship status, which they felt was a kind of where xenophobia was intersecting with racism. And it was sort of an added barrier to the services around sort of assumptions of immigration status being relevant, even when that it simply wasn't. And then also, as Jill mentioned, diversity in services can be a real positive, but how that's used sort of came out through our research that in some cases, for some of our interviewees, they felt like receiving support from someone who came from a minoritized ethnic group themselves tended to sort of correspond with bad news, as if and they felt that they would be receiving services from someone who had a similar minoritized ethnic group background to themselves, in order for them to hear the news that their that whatever service they were trying to access wouldn't be, or the outcomes that they were hoping for wouldn't be met. And so that's how they felt that sort of diversity was being used. And then finally, although data about the sort of the demographics of service users has its value, there was an anxiety that people talked about when they were providing that information, what it was being used for. Some of our interviewees talked about feeling like they weren't sure whether it was necessary and whether or not it was actually harmful. And so the lack of transparency in why that data was needed fueled a reluctance to actually share that information. So that's just a very quick overview of the service-specific findings from our research. So I will hand over back now to Tracy.
Thanks very much for that, Georgia. I'd like just to remind you that if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A so we can then come back to them later on when we heard all the presentations. Right, now we're going to swiftly move on to Henry, who's going to talk about the work they've been doing.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Henry Baptiste from Nottingham, which is in the East Midlands. I'm going to talk about community-led housing. Before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about Pathway Housing Solutions. So we're a Black-led housing organisation that delivers services, but not exclusively to people of colour. We're a social enterprise, which means that our profits go back into delivering a range of community services. But as an organisation, we also undertake a range of research on social justice issues. And our first kind of connection with Heriot Watt Shelter, Crisis and Homelessness was some years ago when we were all looking at issues of race, housing and homelessness. Our approach really is very much about using that research to inform system change and policy change. And the reason for that, I think, is that with research, what tends to happen is it's disseminated at the end of a period and either stays on somebody's bookshelf or stays in their inbox. And for me, I think part of our role is recognizing that as a Black-led organization, we understand some of the challenges that our community face, and that it's almost incumbent upon us to take it to the next step and look at ways in which we can influence system change. We then also use that research really to look at ways in which we can design, either in partnership with others, but to deliver services. We're currently delivering outreach and tenancy support services and a culturally specific service specifically for people of colour. And ultimately, our aim is really to use community-led housing as a vehicle to address the housing crisis. So, as an organisation, I said also we're a member of the Community Land Trust Network, BME National, which is the umbrella body for Black-led Housing Association. And in that capacity, on the BME National, I lead on homelessness on a national level and sit on the National Homelessness Strategic Group. I'm also involved in a program called Agbera 2100, which is essentially a program about community wealth building. And as an organisation, we run a series of capacity building workshops for community groups and individuals that are interested in taking over public assets, be it a library or other form of community building that local authorities are seeking to dispose of. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Tracy. So what is community-led housing? Let me tell you what it's not. It's not council housing. It's not housing association. It's not the private rented sector. Essentially what community-led housing is essentially, as it says on the tin, it's about communities coming together to take control of their own housing situations. It's ultimately about being able to deliver affordable homes for communities, by communities, in the areas that they wish to live. As a model, it's not unique to the UK. It's a model that's transitioned all over the world. But one of the models, which is Community Land Trust, actually came out of the civil rights movement in the States. So our approach really, when we were looking at this research, was to acknowledge the fact that as a concept, as a model, as a way of delivering affordable homes, community-led housing has legs, but it's not widely known. Next slide, please. So yeah, the context to this. So for me, as a Black person leading a Black organisation, working in an environment where we deliver services to people from Black and other racialized minority groups, we're all too familiar with the challenges that people of colour face, not just in terms of discrimination, but also in terms of access to services, access to affordable housing, the fact that in terms of the housing crisis or the economic crisis, the social crisis, Black people tend to be really at the front of that queue. So this statement that you see in front of you, I mean, that's almost 10 years old now. I'm just going to read it out to you. Over 4 decades, which will be more than 4 decades now, of struggle by BME communities, bolstered by whatever legislation from the 1960s onwards, have failed to confront adequately and systematically racial disadvantage and discrimination in housing. And so when we talk about community-led housing, that statement is relevant. The image that you see there, I think that's really open to interpretation. But for me, what it means is that homelessness has a Black face. And the reality is that many organizations deliver services in a Eurocentric way. So moving on to the next slide. So our research then, so the research itself was a 2-year study. It was undertaken by Pathway Housing Solutions, Leeds Community Homes, both of which are practitioner organizations, in partnership with University of Liverpool and Sheffield Hallam University. That's quite a novel way. So the way in which we worked was almost like a co-produced approach. And it's quite a novel way for academic institutions to work with lived practitioner agencies. So there was a lot of learning that took place as part of that process. The research itself was funded by a range of stakeholders, including Nationwide Foundation, and we launched the research at the back end of 2024. The research stakeholders included government agencies, housing associations, infrastructure bodies, funders, community organizations, and individuals. And from our perspective, I suppose one of the key themes that we learned from this really is that the whole sector, the community-led housing sector, is a massive sector. We move on to the next slide. So the research itself, two primary objectives really, was to raise awareness of the barriers encountered by Black and minority ethnic communities when accessing community-led housing, and to enhance understanding and the benefits of community-led housing to Black and minority ethnic communities and relevant stakeholders. And that theme is quite important, simply because it comes from a place where knowledge and understanding of community-led housing is limited generally. Knowledge and understanding of community-led housing as a vehicle to affordable homes is limited. Within the BME community, that is further entrenched. That statement really is against the backdrop where between 2018 and 2022, government invested millions of pounds into this sector. The sector itself grew exponentially. There were enabler hubs situated and regional hubs situated across the country, which delivered capacity building and infrastructure support. So the whole ecosystem of community-led housing was massive at that time. My involvement in it is as a practitioner. As I've said, it's as an organization that wants to deliver homes to people who are on the margins of society, and community-led housing provides and offers an ideal vehicle for that. But as a Black-led organization, we were struggling to access some of the resources and funding and support that were available. And that's what led myself and a colleague called Claude Henriksen from Leeds Community Homes to push for funding to undertake this research. Moving on to the next slide, please. So the key recommendations, I'm not going to swiftly go through these, but these slides will be available to you, I think, at the end of this webinar. The key recommendations were to a range of different key stakeholders, infrastructure bodies, and I'm going to go through this one and describe who they are. So the infrastructure bodies within the sector are the Community Land Trust Network, Cooperative Community Housing, it's also UKCN. So the range of infrastructure bodies that are already established, and underneath them sat a range of regional bodies as well. So what we're asking for is a clear strategy, a strategy to grow BME community-led groups and to develop the number of accredited advisors, BME accredited advisors that can actually go out and reach into communities that are so-called hard to reach. We feel there's benefits in establishing a peer-to-peer group, a network, a national network. And we also recognize that there is a lot of work, a lot of projects, a lot of housing schemes that have been developed historically since the 1970s onwards, but there's very little information in the public domain that actually provides a pathway, a route map, a mentor that talks about those sort of success stories. And what we feel is important really is to catalogue that information and share that information to others. Because essentially what that does is it says to people that it has been done, it can be done. Partnerships with delivery agencies such as housing associations can be developed and adapted. And then we've got to talk about housing funders. I sat on the Lord Adiboli Commission on Social Housing. And so some of the points listed there are points that have been echoed in the past in terms of difficulties for BME organisations, BME community-based organisations accessing funding. You can see there are a number of recommendations that go out specifically to housing funders, one of which is around ring-fencing funding specifically, both revenue and capital. And we've also talked about the role of Homes England, and Homes England plays quite a significant role in terms of funding of housing associations and other housing developments in the private sector, as well as shared ownership. Homes England definitely has a significant role here in terms of bringing forward more housing and targeting that housing for people from BME communities. So moving then on to the next page, please. So further recommendations for councils and devolved government. And when we talk about devolved government in this context, we're talking about combined authorities in the West Midlands. There's West Midlands Combined Authority. In East Midlands, we've got a new combined authority. These new governance structures have power. They may not necessarily have land or property, but they have power and the ability to influence policy decisions around planning and housing and homelessness. And finally, if we move over to housing associations have grown exponentially over years, but ultimately, if you consider the origins of housing associations, they came from a place which was very much about local, very much about meeting the needs of local people. There is an argument to suggest now that housing associations are kind of more removed from their original ethos and philosophy, but we feel that housing associations are ideal partners to support, facilitate, enable community-led housing. There are a range of strategies that they've developed more recently that support that approach, but also acknowledge the role of housing in addressing the housing crisis and homelessness. So for me, I think this research that we've undertaken, it hits a number of buttons. It looks at homelessness, it looks at housing inequality. What it also looks at is a potential opportunity for agencies to work collaboratively with local organisations to bring forward housing for people that are in housing need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, given that overview and the recommendations from the research. I know we're running a bit behind, so we're going to move on swiftly to hear from Harinder from Shelter.
Thank you very much. Really pleased to be here today to share findings from our research. Tracy, if you want to bring up the first slide deck there. Great, thank you. So just in terms of context, this research I'm going to talk through is one of two research pieces that Shelter started in 22-23 as part of our anti-racism commitment, our anti-racism strategy. You have heard many findings already from research that's happened in the last 2-3 years. There's been historical research. Henry's just quoted a piece of research from Shelter in 2016. We know that there's a racism issue in the housing system. For Shelter, this anti-racist commitment was really understanding our own role. What are our own services doing in terms of the way we provide access, what barriers there might be? So this research specifically was looking at our delivery models, our policies and procedures. In 2022, we had started to redesign the way we work with community services, our community priorities. So really wanted to understand whether we had embedded anti-racism as part of our strategy development, but our operational work as well. We wanted to investigate Shelter's services accessibility for people of colour. We have various channels. We have hubs in 11 locations. Helpline, we've been trying to develop lots of different ways of creating better channel access through our web chat. So how has this impacted people's access to their services? And specifically focusing on the type of work that we do with individuals, so casework and advocacy. We'd also in 2022 started to do right awareness sessions. These were members of the public and also working with grassroots organisations. So just really understanding whether we have approached those with an anti-racism lens. Next slide, please. The research was also to understand the experiences of people of colour in the help they receive. So once they've accessed our services, what has their experience been? And for me, both personally and professionally, whilst I really welcome this research, what I wanted to know is whatever we learn, what were we going to do from those learnings? So really ensuring that we have develop a strong action plan, which really helps us not just once, but repeatedly come back and have a look at how we've improved our access to our services. So having an implementation plan and really driving forward the recommendations was a really critical part of our objective setting. Next slide, please. So what did we do? Just a summary. We've already received these results. So this is one of many briefings that we've started to launch internally, and there is a more detailed report to be shared. We recruited equality specialist BRAP. They worked with our research team and really helped focus around the service accessibility. They carried out desk-based research. There were conversations with staff, and we really wanted to ensure that we have a really cross-directorate, cross-team focus and a really wide group of people and people with lived experience in our advisory groups. And that was all part of the initial inquiry. Surveys were sent to staff, 170 responded, community members, 118 people and people of colour responded to those. We had focus groups and interviews with 50 staff, 38 former service users of colour and 11 non-service users. And we will be building further on really understanding those non-service users because of what this research has helped us identify. These initial findings were then shared with workshops with staff and community groups to explore these findings, test what potential options and solutions might be needed here. BRAP have started to work with us to report on the findings internally and the recommendations. We want to make sure our frontline staff and across the organisation we're raising awareness of what we're learning from this research, but also then start building the work for further work around our anti-racism strategy and training. BRAP is helping us develop some guidance and toolkits so we can really continue to embed the anti-racist practices with our services operations. Next slide, please. Key findings. So just thinking about the awareness of shelter, we really wanted to know how aware people of colour and Black people are of shelter services. Now, most people generally knew about shelter, but weren't aware of the full range of services. Shelter was perceived as being distant, formal, and not tailored to diverse communities, and something there for us to really think about, particularly where we have funded services or services that are commissioned. And many expressed a preference for smaller, more local charities, which again for us to really think about our presence in some of the locations that we have. In terms of support needs, people want real-time, person-to-person support with issues, ranging from rent arrears, eviction notices, poor maintenance. We know how many people are in temporary accommodation and the conditions they experience. And this really highlighted how important it is people to have that person-to-person support. People wanted to talk to people when they're experiencing these challenges, that face-to-face conversation, and particularly being able to talk about the discrimination that they're experiencing. And they want to feel dignity and empathy in their interactions. And that is something we really are going to weigh and think about. Like many charities and organisations, we've had a demand narrative. We have funding cuts we've been experiencing. We've designed our services in a way that we want to help people in an emergency situations. Now we need to really reflect on what that impact that's had on people of colour and people from Black communities in terms of how they're able to access our services. How can we build on the iterative learning that we've already started? Interactions with public services, people reported that their interactions unintentionally usually create environments that don't make them feel very welcome or can be very stressful. We know this when people have approached us with, particularly when they've gone to local authorities or other organisations at the time of their crisis. They didn't necessarily describe that's what their experience is at shelter. We didn't really hear them say that about shelter, but their feedback did indicate that there's definitely more we could be doing to visibly counter those stereotypes and to build trust. Next slide, please. Their interactions with shelter. We received some real praise, like web chat being very helpful and efficient, but many people reported feeling frustrated. One, because of the nature of the web advice and not being able to access somebody who can always speak English, but where English isn't their first language. And sometimes it's a really complex way to access support when you need something that's a quick answer. So something for us to just think about the online channels for people. Some reported they didn't feel respected because they didn't really get a chance to tell their story fully, and if staff appeared tired or distracted, and this is particularly in relation to our helpline, where we're dealing with a lot of inquiries, high volume inquiries, and staff had sometimes got their name wrong or mispronounced their name. These are things that are very important to people, particularly in their kind of cultural competence, for us to think about. So again, a lot for us to think about the way that we present ourselves when people come to us in their need. We also then want to draw upon staff experiences. Of course, our anti-racism strategy is really internally focused on making sure we have the right people at the front line of our services. And staff reported that colleagues could sometimes do more to speak for people of colour and Black people, particularly our service users. They have found it quite challenging implementing our anti-racist strategy and our practices. Workload has definitely had an impact in that ability to provide that empathetic support, because we're really pressured time-wise and particularly by some of our funded work. They focus around practical advice rather than emotional pastoral care. And how do we build that into the way that we offer our support and advice? There's also a need for more support implementing anti-racist principles, particularly around training. We've had quite an extensive programme training, and we really need to think about how we can help people embed that. Also, difficulty reaching and engaging with people of colour and Black people, particularly in areas where we don't have a diverse community or a lack of community groups. Next slide, please. So key recommendations, 3 specific areas. One we're already building on is really looking at our service design and delivery. We have to start building a much more integrated model, so that unified vision around advice and advocacy, and ensuring that we are designed in a way that meets the need of people of colour and marginalised communities, rather than purely being led by our funder and contractors. We need to strengthen our partnership with the local community groups, and really thinking about how we can lead differently. Australia wasn't needing to lead from the front. We will be looking at building regular reviews to assess and address barriers regularly for people of colour and Black people and people of colour. And let's have a look at our training and reflective supervision sessions, and really ensuring we've got those active learning sessions. We're not really ensuring that people have time to think about the systemic biases that they've been experiencing, and how they can really ensure they can reflect upon the empathetic engagement that our service users need.
Sorry to interrupt, Harinder. Can I just get you to sort of come to the final point, because we're running
I will
quite
do,
a bit
yeah, very
behind.
quickly. Thank you. And we've also need to be looking at operational framework. So this is the organisation really needs to think about how we can provide that respect and empathy and advocacy in the way that people of colour and Black people need. We need to ensure our leadership is also prioritising that. And also, importantly, community engagement. Now, this one, we've done a lot of work around our contracts, but how can we ensure we develop better accessibility channels through grassroots organisations, and ensuring that service users can really provide their feedback? You want to get to the next one? Sorry, I missed that some, but the details there, so I'll move to the next one. Thank you. And can I just touch upon, so we will be embedding those findings going forward, and I really look forward to be sharing how we've progressed in that in the near future. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Harinder. And let's move swiftly on for Daisy Lund to speak next.
Hi, thanks, Tracy. So as you can see, my name is Daisy Lund. So I'm from Solace Women's Aid, based in London, and I manage our project, the Ruby Project. So we are a pan-London housing first service targeted at supporting global majority women. We're trying to counteract some of the underrepresentation that we've seen in the statistics that have been presented today of how global majority women are not represented well enough in housing first services and generic housing homelessness services. So I'll give you a bit of an insight into the project and the work that we do. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on some of the language first. You may have heard me just then use the term global majority. At Solace, we use this term instead of ethnic minority, BAME, or Black and Asian ethnic minoritized people. This has been developed by our EDI team, and we recognise there's many different opinions and stances on this, and we respect everyone's stance. This is just the term that we use at Solace. One of the reasons why is it helps with reframing narratives. So the term global majority acknowledges that these communities make up approximately 80% of the world's population. So it challenges that Eurocentric view of diversity as minority and reframes the narrative in a more accurate, empowering way. It also recognises systemic dynamics, while ethnic minority highlights demographic statistics within specific regions, such as the UK. It inadvertently centres whiteness as the norm. So global majority shifts that focus to the global perspective and counters narratives of marginalisation rooted in power imbalances. So we also recognise that language consistently changes and it's always evolving. So our EDI team review and update this on a biannual basis. And more importantly, we'll use the term that our clients feel most represents their own identity. And that is the most important thing when thinking about what term to use. Next slide, please. So what is Housing First? So I think if most of you are from a homelessness background, you will be aware. But it's housing for people who have experienced long-term homelessness. So we support those experiencing multiple disadvantage, including rough sleeping and substance abuse, by providing safe accommodation with holistic, long-term, intensive, trauma-informed support. So we enable recovery and maintaining a tenancy and stability within their lives. Housing First has been shown to be effective in supporting people with histories of street homelessness or other types of homelessness where engagement with services have been inaccessible, instability, and on and off in engagement. So we use a person-centered approach, we use assertive outreach, and we meet our clients exactly where they're at. Next slide, please. So just having a look at the principles of Housing First. So the first principle, everyone has a right to a home. This is quite a straightforward one. I think this is quite a highly accepted term. We do give flexible long-term support. So our support for our clients is for as long as they want it. So that could be a year, that could be 5 years, could be 10 years. As long as they feel that they need that service and they need the support, then we will be there to support them. We also ensure that housing and support is separate. So their tenancy is not contingent on our support, and we do not manage their tenancy. So these areas are kept completely separate to ensure that as workers, we can solely focus on our clients' recovery and support and building meaningful relationship with them without getting the kind of the housing element mixed up within that. We also use we also ensure that choice and control are at the basis of our support as well. So the choice of how our client's journey is at the centre, what they want for their lives and how they see their life progressing. That is what is most important in our support, and we make sure to bring it back and keep it at the centre of our support. An active engagement approach. So I touched on this. We use an assertive outreach to continue offering our support, even if a client isn't able to consistently engage at current. So most of our women all of them have maybe had failed engagement before with homelessness services. And to try and counteract that, we really try and meet our client where they're at. So wherever it's easy for them to meet. So whether they are rough sleeping, we meet them on the street, at hostels, at job centre appointments, drug and alcohol drop-in centres, wherever best suits them to ensure that it's as easy as possible for them to engage in our services. And again, we kind of similar to that choice and control, we focus on their goals, strengths and aspirations. So rather than looking at the difficulties that they're experiencing, we focus on what is positive in their life, what strengths do they have that they've put in themselves, and recognizing that they're the experts in their own safety and really empowering them and putting that at the center. And I think one of the most important parts of Housing First is using a harm reduction approach. So we recognise that it is not realistic to expect our clients who are dealing with substance misuse issues to be sober immediately and be able to sustain this throughout the support and throughout their tenancy. So we provide them with resources to ensure that they are using substances and alcohol in the safest way possible. So things like safe needle deposit boxes, needle exchange spots, and ensuring they carry naloxone where they can, and encouraging them that if they want to, work on reducing their intake and getting sober, we'll go to drug and alcohol support services for them. But again, bringing it back to that choice and control, we don't demand that they do this. They need to be in control of their own journey. Next slide, please. So who do we work with and what's our referral criteria? So Solace Women's Aid, we are a violence against women and girls charity, so we support women who are affected by VAWG and experience of multiple disadvantage, including substance misuse, a history of non-engagement, homelessness, physical or mental health issues, contact with the criminal justice system, and having children removed from care. Next slide, please. So we've had a bit of a look at the statistics, and I just wanted to kind of recap because why are the need for this specific service tailored toward global majority women? So in London specifically, Black, Caribbean or African ethnic groups make up 14% of the population and mixed ethnic groups 6%. In the 2023 London's Women's Rough Sleeping Census, which was created by Single Homeless Project, Solace and CGL. Solace are actually currently working with Crisis on the 2024 Women's Rough Sleeping Census. These ethnic groups comprised of 25.8% and 9.2% of the sample respectively. So it shows a much higher prevalence of rough sleeping among women from Black and other ethnic groups. Conversely, Asian ethnic groups equal 21% in the London population and comprise only 6% of the census sample. So there's a significant underrepresentation, which could suggest Asian women are even further hidden in homelessness data than women more generally. So we can see that, we know that Black and minoritized communities are at highest risks of homelessness, but unfortunately, this does not mean that they access and are being supported by frontline services. Next slide, please. So again, looking at the overall number of women who rough sleep in the UK, so looking at that national women's rough sleeping census, of the 795 respondents asked about their ethnicity, 67.4% were white, 15.1% chose Black or Black British, 6.9% chose mixed, 4.7% chose Asian, and 4.5% chose other. Next slide, please. If we compare this with statistics from the evaluation of Housing First pilots in 2024, of all the clients supported through 3 Housing First pilots in the UK, a substantial majority of clients was 85% they were white. Only 4% were Black, only 1% were Asian, and 6% were from mixed backgrounds. Next slide, please. So we can see this difference really clearly here. Even though the 2023 census identified that 15.1% of those rough sleeping were Black, only 4% of this demographic were supported by the Housing First pilots. Similarly, 4.7% were identified as Asian compared to only 1% of people in this demographic in the pilots. So we can really see that global majority women are not reflected by generic Housing First programs. And we even see this within our Westminster and Islington programs within Solace. A huge majority of our women are white women, and we just weren't seeing the referrals coming in for women from global majority backgrounds. So we set up the Ruby project to try and tackle this and get these women who are experiencing hidden homelessness and not being given the same opportunity as others the support that they really needed. Next slide, please. So why weren't global majority women being supported? So I know some other speakers have touched on this as well. Global majority women, for a whole host of reasons, do not feel able to access generic homelessness services. So women face barriers to support which are compounded by intersectionality. So women from a global majority background will face even more barriers to accessing services than their white counterparts. That's not to mention whether they have other areas that impact that, such as disability, age, and etc. Services might feel intimidating to women as well if they are predominantly attended by men, and also if global majority women don't feel represented, and they may often will face racism within service from staff and clients. Women may think because they are less likely to be seen on an outreach shift or rough sleeping in the right way that the services aren't for them, so they'll avoid accessing them. But also being approached by an outreach worker at night can feel really unsafe to women, and can sleeping visibly on the street. Again, this is compounded for women who may face racist as well as gender-based violence. So women may therefore make sure they aren't seen by the public or services. So all of these factor into why they may not be picked up by outreach teams in the first place, and then also again may feel like they're not able to reach out to these services. Next slide, please. Also, just to touch on this as well, 2 other reasons is unconscious bias from referring agencies and systemic barriers and institutional racism in the UK. We're all aware this is a huge issue, but professionals weren't referring their clients from global majority background due to unconscious bias, meaning they were favouring their white women from white backgrounds to send referrals to. And as I said as well, women from global majority backgrounds face more barriers, so it's harder for them to access these services and get the support that they need. Next slide, please. So how did we get these women to be supported by our service? So most importantly, we reached out to buy and for organisations across London to request referrals to discuss the services. So these are the experts in the service. These are the people that know the best how to support themselves. So we reached out to Hopscotch Women's Centre, who we partner with, Ashiana, Imisi, Naya, Forward, and ICRO. And my manager, who kind of launched the service, spoke to over 150 different professionals across London and really made it clear that we're aiming to get referrals from global majority women who aren't typically supported by generic housing first services. And by simply highlighting that our service is open to and encouraging referrals from women from the global majority background, it managed to bypass this unconscious bias that we were seeing through professionals and meant that they were thinking of this demographic first when referring. It's also important, reach out to community associations like community centres and neighbourhood groups. We reached out to these to ensure that they were aware of our service and that they were aware that they could refer these clients. And like I said, changing that language when discussing the service. So really highlighting that we are looking for referrals from women from the global majority background. Next slide, please. So the results, what have we found from this? So within the first year of our project, so we're only smaller, we've only done this for a year, but we managed to find that we managed to get 65% of the women that we support from a global majority background, which exceeded our aim of 25% in the year one. It just really represents how a small effort and small kind of change in the way you're looking for referrals and support can really make a huge difference in the clients that we do support. So I'd really recommend, using that to support these women. Next slide, please. And during support, it's really important to acknowledge that we are not the experts. This project is not claiming that we are the experts in this support. As I said, it's the buy-in for organisations who are the experts in how to support these women from global majorities. It's that we're trying to kind of create an environment where this is the norm, and we are always looking for referrals from this background, from this cohort. It's important as well in supporting these women that we ensure that we focus on cultural competency and use a person-centered approach to support our women in the way that they want specifically. We mustn't let cultural assumptions take over their support and assume the things that they may want help with. It's important that we listen to each and every client about what they want support with and keep choice and control at the centre of that. We take guidance and advice consistently from buy and for organisations such as our partner agency Hopscotch Women's Centre to make sure that we're supporting these women in the best way possible. But like I said, just using that real person-centred and choice-led approach to make sure that every person we are supporting is happy with their support and feels that they're being heard and empowered. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's it from me. Just a little insight. I could talk forever about it because I'm very passionate about it, but it's a little insight into the project that we have. We're going to continue growing, hopefully, and we've had success so far. So I just thank you for giving me the space to discuss it. And if you have any questions, then please feel free to ask, of course.
Thank you very much, Daisy. That was very interesting. So we are now going to go to questions and any comments or reflections from what you've heard so far. You've heard quite a lot from 5 different presenters, and we have about 25 minutes to have a bit of a discussion. I can see there are some questions that have been asked already, and some are quite long, but let's try our best to see if we can get the response. So there are some specific questions to specific speakers, and we have one here at the moment for Harinder. And so the question is asking, so I would like to ask your experience of this work and influencing change internally, if that's okay, because you talked about what you've been doing at Shelter. So this question is saying a big part of this is culture change internally, and my experience of leading on change programs, especially with an anti-racism lens, is that there can be resistance and defensiveness internally, which can stall change. What has your experience been like so far in influencing change within the organisation?
Yeah,
That's
really,
the question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. I often say this a lot. I've been at Shelter over 20 years, so I can really talk to my experience pre-Black Lives Movement and post, and it's been quite a fascinating journey. But I really have welcomed the change at Shelter. My honest answer is it has been challenging because and that's for everybody, that's including people of colour and Black colleagues, because what does this mean for us in our work? What has been really positive is the space that Shelter has created for us to have those safe conversations and brave conversations. We have had a lot of external input, facilitators, great speakers come and share this journey and kind of help us along the way. I formerly was chair of the Race Equality Network and really started to see a sea change in the behaviours, the attitudes within the organisation, and really strong allyship. So I think you've talked about resistance there. I won't say there hasn't been resistance, but we've had to take time to understand what was that resistance, what's underpinning it. And often it was people not being sure what's expected of them, fear, changes to their roles, what this meant for them. So Shelter's had to take a very inclusive approach to ensuring that we take people on this journey and build time for everyone to be able to have safe and brave conversations. And we've recently had our Your Voice survey across the organisation, and the results pre-Black Lives Movement post it's just been phenomenal. So I'm really proud to be working at Shelter, that we have really started to transition as an organisation internally. But this work is never done. It's ongoing. Staff turnover, new people joining, new contracts. There's always change. So for us, it's something we revisit again and again. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Harinder. So we have a couple of questions which are both, well, back to you, Harinder, both to Crisis and Shelter. So I'm assuming Harinder, Jill, and Georgia. Sorry, not Jill, but Georgia. So the question is, they're quite long. Let's see if I can quickly summarise it. So both Crisis and Shelter, could you provide a breakdown of the participants' age and the specific ethnicity involved in the research? I'm not sure if there's something quickly that can be said, and what staff grades were included and where in the country were they located? I don't know if you...
Yeah, I've just popped a response to that in the chat. I'll need to pull out the more detailed report, so it's not to hand. I've covered a little bit of it in my presentation, so hopefully some of the detail is there. But we will be publishing the report, and sorry, it's not a quick answer, but we will be publishing the report. Please look at our website in February and March time, and definitely that information will be available. When we commissioned the research, we really did want to ensure we're covering a lot of different locations. Shelter's based in 11 locations, and obviously we have our national helpline, Birmingham, London, Manchester, but the actual breakdown of the participants, that will be certainly available when we publish the report. So please do look out for that.
Thank you. And to Georgia, in terms of Crisis, there's an additional question, which is what activities or actions have the crisis response team implemented in response to the research?
Sure. Okay. So, Cedric, in response to your question about the breakdown of participants, I've just put a snip of the research report to show the ethnicities of the people who participated, and we're aware that people from a Black ethnic background were well represented and others less so, and I think that that's important for us for future research, which Crisis have committed to exploring this, the areas around racism and homelessness at a more fine-grained level, because this was our first foray into research into this area, and so we hope to kind of refine that further, add more to the evidence base, but hopefully be able to represent other groups who aren't from a Black background more in other research. And in terms of what activities or actions are being implemented, so it's still quite early days. This research came out, the research that we did came out in October, and the first bit of time has been really for us all to reflect and feel how it lands, because it's really important for us. There has been a task force set up within the client services Directorate, which is our sort of service user frontline work, who are going to be steering this and taking it forward in with our own race equity network at Crisis. What we plan to do, and what we did plan to do as a response to the research itself, isn't to put out recommendations more wider to to the rest of the sector, but more recommendations for ourselves, which was to understand how much our service is meeting or is not meeting the needs of people from different Black minoritized ethnic groups. So we are going to be doing a suite of internal work, looking at who is not being represented in our services, and by looking at where our services are and the demographics locally, and trying to do a review of our service to understand what are the barriers in terms of our service for people of colour to access our services, to use them, and also to reach the same outcomes. And so we're really doing a bit of a kind of internal review ourselves, much like Harinder was talking about in Shelter. And so we haven't implemented anything yet, because we want to really take a good long deep exploration into our own services on that front.
Thanks, Georgia. We've got a question for Henry now. It's quite a long question, so I'm going to try and summarise it. So this is also from Cedric, which essentially that the Black cooperative movement was very much encouraged soon after the Brixton riots. What new stimulus or catalyst is needed to encourage more Black people to set up in cooperatives, and whether that should be done by widening the existing networks of cooperative movement? And then it's given examples, so perhaps to, Black entrepreneurs, for example, etc. So essentially, what do you think needs to be done to be a sort of catalyst to encourage more Black people?
Well, thanks for that question, Cedric. You will have access to the report and the summary as well, and the summary provides you with some of the key recommendations across a range of sectors, including recommendations for councils, combined authorities, housing associations, etc. The 1980s, I guess you're talking about, yeah? So the 1980s, there were riots across the whole of the UK, race riots that took place at that time. And during that time, I think it was the Thatcher government introduced a number of measures through the Housing Corporation to stimulate the growth of BME-led, Black-led housing associations. For me, I think what is required is intervention at a number of levels, right? So I think there needs to be an intervention at government level, as there was in the past. I think there needs to be intervention at the funders level, so social finance institutions and high street lenders, in the way in which they allocate their resources. And for me, I think one of the crucial things here is the lack, and you kind of pointed to this, the lack of awareness in our own communities. And when I say communities, I'm not just talking about community groups, but Black entrepreneurs, established community-based housing organisations, Black-led housing associations, even of themselves aren't familiar with the community-led housing model. So we're almost like pushing at a closed door. So one of the crucial things really is recognising there's so many different layers to this and so many different sides to it. So for what we're trying to do, what we are looking to do is to set up a task force. So for me, that task force can take on the responsibility of pulling all those strands together in a coherent and focused approach. And if that's something that you're interested in, Cedric, then touch base with me, yeah? So that's my response to that question so far. Will do. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we can actually sort of link you up together to follow up on that. There is another question. I think this is probably more for Georgia, although all of you've touched on racist discrimination that has impacted on communities who are homeless. So the question is from Michaela, who's from Race on the Agenda, which is how has this research been received by policymakers, and in particular that racist discrimination faced by the communities, particularly in the private rental sector. However, the Renters' Bill does not address race, which is concerning given the barriers that the communities face. How is Crisis raising this issue, and is there any opportunity for us to contribute to shaping this conversation?
I'm actually going to answer that one if that's right on behalf of Crisis. So apologies, I'm not a policy expert, so I can only kind of answer it to the best of my ability. But we in the Crisis Research and Evaluation team have worked quite closely with the policy campaigns and public affairs teams on getting engagement from policymakers around these issues. So around the launch of the research, our colleagues in campaigns and public affairs sent out the report with sort of personalised covering letters to a few MPs, and we have had some positive responses from some who are interested in meeting to talk more about the issues raised in the report. As well as that, the APPG on ending homelessness is going to be discussing the issue of racism and homelessness at a meeting coming up in April, I think, and we're hopefully going to have at least one of the community researchers who co-produced this research with us as part of that meeting to talk about the upcoming strategy on homelessness that this government will hopefully be developing and implementing, and we're really keen to keep race and racism and ethnicity on the agenda for that. We did have some further policy recommendations in the report, which we sort of wrote with the policy team, also taking input from the recommendations that were suggested by the community researchers. So these do include the cross-governmental strategy, which I mentioned, and aiming for that to address issues of racism in housing and homelessness, and also some recommendations around immigration and how refugees and asylum seekers are affected by some of the issues raised in the report, it came out as quite a strong theme in the Crisis and community researcher report, that racism and the immigration system sort of intersect quite heavily. So we have made some recommendations around ending right to rent checks, for example, and also looking at the impact of no recourse to public funds. That's it from me.
Thank you, Alice. I think we've got some comments from Jill, Harinder, and Henry. So I'll let you go first, Jill. But just to say that I do want to take another question from the chat before we get to the end of the webinar. So, Jill.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it was just to say, lovely to virtually meet you as well, Michaela. As you said, raising the agenda, been part of our research, and I know you've recently joined, and we will link up individually with you after this call. But as Alice said, we are working through our own programme leads at Heriot-Watt and through other organisations, including the advisory group, to make contact with government, and are on some of the task and finish groups that are ongoing at the moment in terms of looking at a new homelessness strategy. And very much this evidence is being fed in to those groups, and we really hope that it's a much more fertile policy environment at the moment, and we will see some change. But I'll pass on. I know that Harinder and Henry had something to add as well.
Great, thank you. Just very quickly, I just want to say we definitely are working very closely with our policy team at Charter. We have a second piece of research which will be published in the summer, which is around the access to social housing. And when we first were designing this research, for me, the really critical question was, and so what? Whatever we learn, we need to make sure there's a real call for action. And what's really great with all the research that you've been hearing about today, we're all talking to each other, we're all supporting each other and making sure that our individual research areas don't become siloed projects, and we really are going to be supporting each other and making sure there's that call for action.
Thank you. Henry?
Yeah, just to respond to that question, Pathway House Solutions did some research on race, housing and homelessness a couple of years ago, and so we understand that the difficulties in terms of informing and influencing kind of policy change, both at a local level and a national level. But in my capacity as a member of the National Housing Federation's Homeless Strategic Group, there are key kind of links in terms of government policy and also housing policy that we're looking to influence at that level. But I think the other thing to echo as well is that as a network, ourselves, Heriot Watt, Homeless Link, Crisis and Shelter are linked into a kind of race research practitioners network. So there is that conversations that take place in the background in terms of how we can align and focus the kind of outcomes and recommendations that comes from the work that we're individually and collectively involved in.
Thank you for that, Henry. The final two questions I'm going to pass over to Daisy. And these are both from Alex Smith. So the first question is, has learning from the Ruby project influenced any changes in your other Housing First services? And then the second question is, do you think it is possible or should mainstream Housing First services aim to work with more global majority residents, or are more specialist services more appropriate? Over to you, Daisy.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for the question, Alex. It's a really great question, and it gives me a chance to kind of talk about something that I touched on and towards the end of the presentation. In answer to your first question, there's definitely been learning from the Ruby project for our other Housing First services. At the moment, they're currently at capacity, so haven't been able to welcome any more clients from global majority backgrounds, but we have consistent joint reflection between the teams and meetings to reflect on some of the issues and barriers that we've kind of experienced when supporting global majority women and how to overcome those. So whether that's with advocating to external services or the barriers that they face within support, and we kind of continually keep that line of communication open so that when they are able to bring in more clients, then they feel as prepared as possible and kind of feedback to each other and reflect on that. So there's definitely been that there. It's just, yeah, at the moment they're at capacity, so they're not able to welcome any more people in, but we're consistently talking around how best to support women from global majority background and kind of identifying services within Westminster and Islington that are by and for organisations that they can help, to support the women that they are currently working with from global majority backgrounds. So definitely, and I hope that will continue. In answer as well to the second question, do you think it's possible, should mainstream Housing First services aim to work with more global majority residents? Absolutely, yes. 100% yes. I think that's kind of the main takeaway that I want to kind of give from my presentation today. Generic Housing First services should absolutely be reaching out to by and for organisations to request referrals and encourage referrals from global majority clients. By only referring our global majority clients to services that we think are specifically for them, it's just further excluding them from these services. And it means that they get far less opportunity to receive support. We need to make sure that they are accessing generic services, and making sure that people are consistently thinking about referring these people and as many services as possible, because they need those opportunities. It's imperative that this is done. I think as well, kind of, we need to make sure that you're doing this in partnership with by and for organisations. So reaching out to the by and for organisations in your area, seeing who can support different groups of people, different cultures, and making sure that you have partnerships with them so that you can reach out to them for support and refer your clients to them. And in doing that in a partnership way, it means that you can really provide like kind of a real holistic wraparound support to ensure that the clients are supported in all areas of their lives and ensuring, incorporating cultural competence. So even if you feel like you're a mainstream organisation who aren't perhaps equipped to support global majority people from global majority background, put that to the side. You need to make sure that you're encouraging these referrals and then reaching out to the experts in the support from by and for organisations to make sure that you have the expertise to support these people. But, by just specifically referring them to the services that you think are for them, like I said, it just further excludes these people. So we need to make sure that everyone is working together to receive referrals from women and men from global majority backgrounds. Like I said, if there's one, sorry,
I thought you'd come to the end and say thank you very much.
I just have a tiny little thing to say and then I'll stop. But yeah, if there's one thing I'd like people to take away from the presentation, is that it's so important to make those small changes in order to encourage referrals from global majority clients. We need to really make sure that we're focusing on what clients want for their support as well, individually, without letting cultural assumptions take over. So listening to these people, if they want referrals to other by and for organisations to help deal with these cultural competence, like these cultural issues that you may not have expertise on, then do that for them and support them in that. but just make sure that, you know, you're listening to what our specific clients want, rather than using those cultural assumptions to take over what you think they might be experiencing and the experience that they are having individually. But yeah, I'd really encourage everyone to just make those small changes to encourage those referrals and support them in the best way you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Well, I've got 4 minutes, so I am going to take one more question. This is to Harinder, so we've got literally very short time to respond. It's from Lucy from Homeless Link, and she's asking you, so your slides mention the importance of leadership development in embedding anti-racist practice. What more do you think can be done around supporting people of colour into leadership roles within homelessness organisations?
Yeah, great question, Lucy. This is something that Shelter has specifically commissioned somebody to work with Shelter to do this. We've got succession planning that's been built in. We're doing some mapping around the talent within the organisation. A lot of work with our recruitment team as well, looking at our recruitment processes, job descriptions, where are we promoting us? So there's a lot of different activities, but internally we need to ensure that people, when they are going through actual recruitment and when they are supporting their staff, it's very much part of what we do in terms of objective setting and reviews. So it's a multifaceted piece of work that we need to do. And that, again, is something we've been building on since last year, and recognise that it's still going to take more time to plan and do. We're starting to see real improvements in recruitment of people within management roles, and we're looking at talent within. So I manage the legal team, and I've done extensive talent mapping of who I have at the moment and their career progression for people of colour and Black colleagues. Every department's been asked to do that. So yeah, it's multifaceted, the approach that we take, but we really recognise that there are gaps where we are not getting people applying for certain roles, and we need to understand why.
Thank you very much, Harinder. So we've come to the end of this webinar. So I'd like to thank everyone who presented today. I think it's been really interesting in terms of the research, but also the work that's actually happening at the moment, and there are opportunities for you to collaborate. In terms of our next steps, we will be having the final webinar in this series, and that's going to take place on the 31st of March, similar time as today. And this will be a slightly different focus, because what we'll be looking at is how systems must change to reduce overrepresentation of people of colour in housing precarity and homelessness. And the details of how you can register for this event will be sent out in due course. In the meantime, the webinar film from the first one that was held last year is now available on YouTube. The stories behind the statistics, and we can also send out the link if people are not sure how to access that. So I would like to thank you for giving up your time to attend this session today, and thank all the presenters again for the wonderful information they provided to us all, and it's food for thought. And now we just need to see what has to happen and what solutions we need to take in terms of improving homelessness services. I think that's it. I haven't forgotten anything. I'm looking at the rest of the team, and so that's fine. Thank you very much, and we will see you at the next webinar, hopefully. Bye bye, everyone.